The morning Cora Doyle stepped off the westbound stage in Harlan Creek, Texas. She had exactly $4.62 to her name, a carpetbag with a broken clasp, and a letter she had already read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. The year was 1878, and the town of Harlan Creek sat at the edge of nowhere in particular, a rough collection of sun-bleached buildings pressed against the flat, dry earth of West Texas like a man leaning into a wind that never stopped blowing. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a church with a crooked steeple, and a land office that smelled permanently of dust and old money. Beyond all of it, stretching out in every direction until the sky swallowed it whole, was open range that belonged, for the most part, to one man. Cora did not know that yet. She stood on the plank sidewalk outside the stage depot with the broken carpetbag at her feet and squinted into the morning light. She was 24 years old, tall for a woman, with brown hair the color of creek water after a rain and gray eyes that tended to take stock of situations before her mouth did. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped conversation, but there was something steady and serious in her face that made people look twice, as though they were trying to work out a problem they had not known they needed to solve. The letter in her hand was from a solicitor in Austin named Grady Baines. It informed her, in the patient and regretful language that solicitors use when they are delivering bad news to someone who has very little, that her intended husband, one Mr. Franklin Doyle, her late uncle's business partner, who had agreed through a formal arrangement 3 months prior to take Cora as his wife in exchange for settling a debt her deceased father had left behind, had himself died of a fever 6 weeks ago. The debt, Mr. Baines further explained, had transferred to the estate, and the estate had no obligation to honor the personal arrangement. Cora was, in the legal and practical sense, on her own. She had known this before she boarded the stage. She had received the letter in Fort Worth, where she had been waiting at a cousin's crowded house for enough funds to make the final leg of the journey west. The cousin, a brittle woman named Edna with 4 children and a husband who resented every mouth he had not personally fathered, had made it quietly but completely clear that Cora was not a permanent solution to any of Edna's problems. When the letter came and the arrangement dissolved, Edna had said, in a tone of practiced sympathy, that perhaps Cora should keep going west anyway. Something would turn up. Cora had kept going west. Not because she believed something would turn up, but because going back east meant going back to nothing, and at least going forward was a direction. The stage driver tossed her a second piece of luggage, a small trunk that belonged to another passenger, and she stepped aside to let the confusion of disembarking sort itself out. The street was already busy for early morning. A man in a leather apron was sweeping the steps of the general store. 2 cowboys in dusty trail clothes were tying horses to the hitching post outside the saloon with the practiced efficiency of men who had done it 1,000 times. A woman in a gray dress was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 buildings, moving with the efficiency of someone who had stopped noticing the repetition of her own days. Cora picked up her carpetbag and walked to the general store because it was the nearest building, and because she needed someone to tell her where the land office was. She was not entirely sure what she planned to do at the land office. She had some notion, half-formed and desperate, that there might be work. Filing, perhaps. She had a tidy hand and a good head for figures, both things her father had taught her before the drinking took him properly and permanently. The man in the leather apron looked up when she came in. He was middle-aged with a fringe of red hair and the cautious eyes of someone who has spent years reading customers. "Morning," he said. "You come in on the stage." "I did," Cora said. "I'm looking for work if you know of any, and I need to know where I might find a room I can afford until I've found some." The man, whose name turned out to be Pete Calloway, looked her over without being rude about it and then scratched the side of his jaw. "Work's scarce in Harlan Creek unless you're talking about ranch work or saloon work, and I'd guess you're not talking about either one. Miss Delaney over at the boarding house might have a room, but it runs $3 a week." Cora thought about her $4.62 and did not say anything. "There is one other possibility," Pete said, leaning on his counter with the look of a man about to deliver gossip dressed up as useful information. "Jeremiah Walden up at the Crossbar Ranch has been asking around for someone with bookkeeping sense. His foreman was doing the ranch accounts and rode off 6 weeks ago without a word. Took about half the ledger records with him too, which made the whole thing worse. Walden's been trying to make sense of it himself ever since, and from what I hear, it's not going well." "Jeremiah Walden," Cora said. "Biggest ranch in 3 counties," Pete said. "About 4,000 head of cattle on 60,000 acres. He's got money to spare and enough problems to fill a barn. He'd pay fair, I reckon, for someone who knows numbers." Cora said she would think about it, bought a 5-cent piece of cornbread from the case on the counter because she had not eaten since the night before, and walked back outside into the heat. She stood on the sidewalk and ate the cornbread and looked at the town around her and did the arithmetic of her situation. It was not complicated arithmetic. She had enough money for a room for 1 night, possibly 2 if she did not eat. She had no connections in Harlan Creek, no family within 300 miles, no trade skills beyond literacy and numbers, and no arrangement of any kind now that Franklin Doyle was in the ground. She had come all this way with nothing to offer and no one waiting to receive her. She finished the cornbread and dusted her fingers on her skirt and walked back into the general store. "Where is the Crossbar Ranch?" she asked Pete Calloway. He told her it was 4 miles north of town, up the main road until she hit a gate with an iron crossbar welded across the top of it, which was where the name came from. He also told her that Jeremiah Walden was not an easy man. "He's fair," Pete added carefully, "but he doesn't have much patience for things that don't work the way they're supposed to." Cora thought about that and decided it was not the most alarming thing anyone had ever told her about a potential employer. She arranged to leave her carpetbag with Pete for safekeeping, borrowed the use of a horse from the livery for $1 that she told herself was an investment rather than an extravagance, and rode north. The road out of Harlan Creek was dry and straight, and flanked on either side by scrub brush and occasional stands of mesquite. The land was flat enough that she could see the gate from a half-mile away, a solid iron crossbar across 2 wooden posts, with the crossbar brand burned into a wooden sign hanging from the center of it. Beyond the gate, the road continued between fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the morning heat, and in the far distance she could see the buildings of the ranch itself, a large main house, several outbuildings, a barn the size of a small church, and the long, low shape of a bunkhouse. She rode up to the main house and tied the borrowed horse at the post and straightened her dress, which was the best she had and which was not particularly impressive. Then she knocked on the front door. Nobody answered. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. She walked around the side of the house toward the barn because the sounds coming from that direction suggested activity. She found it in the form of a man standing in the middle of the barn's central aisle with a ledger book open in one hand and a look on his face like a man who has been reading the same sentence for 20 minutes, and it keeps meaning something different. Jeremiah Walden was 31 years old, and he was the kind of man that West Texas produced in a particular mold. Big through the shoulders, lean in the hips, with dark hair that had been bleached at the temples by the sun and hands that were rough from 30 years of physical work, even though he had owned this land for 4 of them. He had strong, angular features and dark eyes that were currently creased in a way that communicated irritation and concentration in equal measure. He was wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and trail-dusty canvas pants, and he had not shaved in at least 3 days. He looked up when Cora appeared in the barn doorway, and the irritation in his face reorganized itself into simple wariness. "You're not from here," he said. "No," Cora said. "I came in on this morning's stage. My name is Cora Doyle. Pete Calloway in town told me you were looking for someone with bookkeeping skills." Jeremiah looked at her for a moment, then looked back down at the ledger as though it might have changed while he was not watching. "My foreman kept the accounts," he said. He left. The records he left behind are a mess, and the ones he took with him are gone. How long ago? 6 weeks. And you've been working on it yourself since then. He looked up again with an expression that suggested the answer was yes, and that the experience had not improved his opinion of ledger books. I run cattle, he said. I don't run numbers. Those are different things. May I see it? Cora asked. He handed the ledger over without ceremony, which she took as either trust or desperation, possibly both. She stood in the barn doorway with morning light coming over her shoulder and opened the book to the first page. She spent several minutes turning pages slowly, reading the columns, tracing the notes with her finger. Your foreman was skimming, she said. Jeremiah went very still. What? Not large amounts at once, small ones consistently. $1 here, $3 there. If you look at the feed expenditure column against the actual head count your ranch can support, there's about $160 unaccounted for over the last 2 years. Maybe more depending on what records he took. She closed the ledger and held it back out to him. I can reconstruct what I can, but if the records he took were the earlier years, there may be losses I can't trace. Jeremiah took the ledger back slowly. He looked at it, then at her. Pete Calloway sent you. He mentioned the situation, Cora said. I'm looking for work. What kind of work? Any kind that pays honest, she said. I can keep accounts. I can write correspondence. I can do inventory. I'm good with figures and I don't make mistakes twice. He looked at her for another long moment. The wariness had not entirely left his face, but something else was working its way in alongside it, something that looked like calculation. Where are you from? Fort Worth most recently. Before that, Georgia. I came west for a different arrangement that fell through. He did not ask what arrangement. She appreciated that. I've got a spare room in the main house, he said. It's used for storage mostly. You'd have to clear it out. Meals are with the hands in the cookhouse. Pay is $12 a month plus the room and board. He paused. It's not what you'd call glamorous. I've had glamour before, Cora said, which was not entirely true, and it didn't particularly help me. He looked at her sharply then, as though she had said something that resonated in a way he had not expected. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. All right, Miss Doyle, he said. The job is yours if you want it. She wanted it. She rode back to town, settled her account with the livery, collected her carpetbag from Pete Calloway, and rode back out to the Crossbar before noon. The spare room turned out to contain 2 broken saddles, a crate of fence posts, and approximately 40 years of someone's old newspapers. But it had a window that faced east and a door with a proper latch, and it was hers. She spent the rest of the day clearing it out with the help of a young ranch hand named Billy, who was about 19 and cheerful in the uncomplicated way of young men who have not yet had their optimism tested significantly. He moved the saddles and the fence posts without being asked twice, and seemed genuinely pleased to have something specific to do. By evening, the room was habitable. By the time Cora ate supper with the ranch hands in the cookhouse, she had spoken to every man on the crew at least briefly, and had formed opinions about most of them. There were 7 hands in total, ranging from Billy at 19 to an older man named Hector Rodriguez who had been on the ranch since before Jeremiah bought it, and who had the calm, deliberate authority of a man who knows exactly how much he is relied upon. Jeremiah ate supper with his men, which she had not expected. He sat at the end of the table and ate without ceremony and spoke when spoken to, and listened more than he talked, and she found herself watching him from across the table trying to work out the architecture of him. That first week, they established a working rhythm. She spent the mornings at the desk in the small room off the main house that served as an office, working through the surviving ledgers and reconstructing as much of the financial history as the records allowed. Jeremiah came in each morning and looked over her shoulder for a while without saying anything, and then went out to do the work of running the ranch and came back in the evening sometimes to ask questions and sometimes just to look at the progress she had made. He was not a warm man exactly, but he was not a cold one either. He was a precise man. He spoke carefully, as though he had learned through experience that careless words cost you something. He did not raise his voice. He did not make promises he was not confident of keeping. He treated his hands with the same directness he extended to everyone without condescension, and they repaid it with a loyalty that was obvious even after only a few days of watching. On the 5th day, he came into the office in the evening and sat down across the desk from her while she was finishing the day's work and said, "You were right about Hadley. That was his name. My foreman. I asked around town, and there are 2 other ranchers who had trouble with him. He was running the same scheme on all 3 of us." "Did you get any of it back?" Cora asked. "Hadley's in the wind, probably down toward Mexico by now." He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. $160 isn't the end of the world. The ranch runs fine. I just don't like being taken for a fool." "You weren't a fool," Cora said. "You were busy and you trusted someone who didn't deserve it. Those aren't the same thing." He looked at her with those dark eyes and said nothing for a moment. "You're surprisingly direct for someone who's been here less than a week and needs the job." "I've learned that being indirect doesn't protect your position," she said. "It just delays the conversation." He studied her face for a moment as though testing the truth of that statement against some private measure. Then he said, "Good night, Miss Doyle," and got up and went to his part of the house. She sat there for a moment in the lamplight and felt something she had not expected. She felt settled. Not safe exactly, not arrived, but settled, like a compass needle that has finally stopped swinging. The weeks that followed built themselves around work, which Cora understood was the currency of that place and time. She finished the account reconstruction by the end of the 3rd week, and presented Jeremiah with a clean set of books and a summary of the situation. He read through it twice without speaking, then looked up and said that it was the clearest financial document he had ever seen, and she said that was a lower bar than it should be for a ranch of this size, and he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It surprised her. It was not a polished laugh. It was genuine and a little rough at the edges, like something that didn't get much use, and it changed his face entirely. She found herself thinking about it later than was strictly appropriate. The social geography of Harlan Creek sorted itself out over those weeks as well. On Sundays, the town gathered, in the way that small western towns gathered in 1878, around the church and then around the general store, and then around whatever news had accumulated during the week. Cora attended with the ranch, sitting with Hector's wife Maria and their 2 young children in the pew second from the back, and gradually the women of the town extended toward her the cautious, calibrated welcome that frontier communities offered to newcomers who had proven themselves neither a burden nor a threat. There was a woman named Ruth Bancroft who ran the town's only school in a single room, and who became, over the course of several conversations, something approximating a friend. Ruth was about 30, sharp-tongued and quick-minded, recently widowed, and had no patience for the kind of romantic nonsense that passed for conversation in some quarters, but a great deal of patience for the kind of serious, genuine talk that was harder to find. She and Cora ate lunch together on Sundays after church when Cora was in town, sitting on the steps of the church with whatever food was available and talking about books and weather, and the particular challenges of being a woman alone in a place that had not entirely worked out what to do with that. "Jeremiah Walden," Ruth said one Sunday in early October in the tone of a woman raising a topic she has been thinking about for a while. "What's he like up close?" "He's fair," Cora said carefully. "He works hard. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." Ruth gave her a look that was doing several things at once. "He's had women try," she said. "He was engaged once about 3 years ago before he bought the Crossbar. Girl from San Antonio, family with money. They called it off before the wedding. Nobody knows exactly why. He never talks about it." Cora thought about that and looked at the street in front of her and said nothing. "I'm just telling you what there is to know," Ruth said mildly. "I'm his bookkeeper," Cora said. "Yes," Ruth said, in the tone of someone who has said all they intend to say on a subject for now. The incident that changed things happened in late October, on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky had turned the particular shade of yellow-gray that meant weather coming. Cora was in the office working on the quarterly accounts when she heard raised voices from outside, which was unusual enough at the Crossbar to make her look up. She went to the window and saw, in the yard in front of the barn, Jeremiah standing very still with his arms loose at his sides, while a man she did not recognize sat on a horse and talked at him in a tone that was too loud for friendly conversation. The man was heavyset and red-faced and wearing clothes that had more money in them than sense, and from the window she could hear snatches of what he was saying, words like property line and survey and my father's deed. His name, she found out later, was Douglas Hale. His father had owned the land that bordered Crossbar to the east before selling it, somewhat irregularly, to Jeremiah's predecessor. Douglas Hale had decided, now that his father had recently died, that the original sale had included an error in the survey that gave the Crossbar access to a section of water rights that properly belonged to the Hale family. He wanted the water rights back. He had not brought a lawyer to discuss this. He had brought two men who were sitting their horses slightly behind him in the way that men do when they are present to communicate a point rather than participate in a conversation. Jeremiah listened to all of this with his arms still loose at his sides and his face very still, and when Douglas Hale finished, Jeremiah said, in a voice that was perfectly even, that if Mr. Hale had a legitimate grievance about the survey, he was welcome to take it to the land office in Harlan Creek where the original deed was registered, and that any subsequent legal question could be addressed through proper channels, and that in the meantime the men on his property without invitation could return to wherever they had come from. Douglas Hale did not like that answer. His voice got louder. His two men shifted on their horses. Cora, watching from the window, saw the moment when the situation could tip, and acted without particularly deciding to. She came out of the house with the office copy of the Crossbar land deed in her hand, which she had been reviewing just that morning as part of the quarterly reconciliation, and she walked across the yard and stopped beside Jeremiah and held the deed up toward Douglas Hale. "If you're talking about the eastern section water rights," she said clearly, in her most accountant's voice, which was precise and calm and had no particular interest in being pleasant, "the 1874 survey recorded in Harlan Creek is very clear. The Crossbar's access to that water predates the section of the Hale property you're describing by 2 years. Any competing claim would need to be taken to the county seat in Abilene, and it would need to be substantial because this deed was recorded and witnessed and has not been challenged in 4 years. Douglas Hale stared at her. "Who the hell are you?" "I am the person who has spent the last 3 weeks reviewing every document attached to this ranch's title," Cora said. "I'm familiar with the deed." There was a silence. The yellow-gray sky had moved closer. Douglas Hale looked at the deed in her hand, then at Jeremiah, then back at her, and the calculation going on behind his eyes was visible and not particularly flattering to him. "This isn't over," he said. "You're welcome to take it to Abilene," Cora said again, pleasantly. Douglas Hale pulled his horse around and rode out, his two men falling in behind him, and the three of them went back down the road toward town at a pace that was slightly faster than dignified. There was a pause. Cora lowered the deed and looked at Jeremiah. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not quite the wary calculation of their first meeting, not the quiet respect of their working days. Something more unguarded than either, something that seemed to cost him a little. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I had the deed in my hand," she said. "That's not why you did it." She met his eyes and did not immediately answer because he was right and she was trying to decide what to do with that. "The water rights are in the deed," she said finally. "Douglas Hale knows it or he would have sent a lawyer instead of two men with horses." "Yes," Jeremiah said quietly. "He knows it." He looked at her for another moment, then at the deed in her hand, then at the road where Hale had disappeared. Then he said, "Thank you, Miss Doyle." And the way he said it was different from the way he had said it before, fuller and more careful, like something he was setting down with deliberate hands. She went back into the office and sat at the desk and looked at the deed for a while without seeing it. The weather that had been threatening came that night. Not a violent storm, but a long, steady rain that drummed on the roof of the ranch house and turned the yard to mud by morning and made the whole world smell like wet earth and grass. Cora lay in her room and listened to it and felt the peculiar specific ache of being in a place that was becoming real to her, that was becoming something like belonging, and understanding that belonging was a dangerous thing to need. She had come to Harlan Creek with nothing to offer. $4.62 and a broken carpetbag, and a letter from a solicitor explaining that an arrangement she had never particularly wanted had dissolved before it could make her moderately safe. She had told herself that she was resourceful, that she would find work, that she would build something of her own. She had not told herself that she would find herself thinking about a man's rough laugh in the lamplight of a ranch house office in West Texas, or about the way he had looked at her across a muddy yard in the yellow light before a rain. She was sensible enough to know what that meant. She was also sensible enough to know that Jeremiah Walden had been engaged once and had no obligation to be interested in a woman who had arrived in his life through a chain of mishaps. She told herself this several times while listening to the rain, and it helped somewhat. 3 days after the rain, on a Saturday afternoon, Hector Rodriguez came to find her at the office with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man carrying news he is not sure how to give. His wife Maria had gone into labor 6 weeks earlier than expected. The nearest doctor was in Abilene, 40 miles away. Hector's face was the color of chalk under his dark complexion. "Have you ever?" he started. "Yes," Cora said, which was not entirely true but was true enough. She had helped her aunt with 3 births back in Georgia, and she had paid attention. She followed Hector to the small adobe house at the edge of the ranch property where he and Maria lived with their children, and she spent the next several hours being useful in the quiet and concentrated way that emergency demands. Jeremiah showed up at some point, having heard from Billy, and stood outside the door of the house with Hector and the 2 children, and she could hear them through the wall, Jeremiah talking to Hector in a low, steady voice the way a man talks to another man who is frightened and needs something to hold on to. The baby came at dusk, small and red and furious, a boy. He was early, but he was breathing and he was loud about it, and when Maria held him and Hector came in and saw them, he put his face in his hands and his shoulders shook, and Cora stepped back to give them the privacy of that moment. She came out into the evening air and found Jeremiah sitting on the step outside with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, looking at the sky. He looked up when she came out. "Boy," she said. Small but strong, he let out a long breath. "Maria, she's good, tired, happy." He nodded, and the relief on his face was raw and unguarded in the way that men's faces get when they have been afraid for someone they care about and the fear has just receded. He looked at her for a moment in the last of the evening light, and then he said, quietly, "You keep doing things, Cora Doyle." It was the first time he had used her first name. She sat down on the step beside him, not close, just beside. The evening was cooling fast the way evenings did in October in West Texas, the heat of the day pulling back like a tide, and the stars were beginning to come up in the eastern sky, one at a time the way they did out here, where there was no town light to argue with them. "Hector is a good man," she said. "The best I know," Jeremiah said simply. They sat in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of 2 people who have discovered that the other person is someone they can be quiet with, which is a different thing from simply running out of conversation. After a while, Jeremiah said, without looking at her, "Where did you learn to do that, the birth?" "My aunt," she said, "back in Georgia. She had 3 children after I came to live with her, and there was never enough money for a doctor except for the last one." She paused. "I learned that if you pay attention, you can do more than you think you can." "What happened to your parents?" She had not talked about this yet, not to anyone in Harlan Creek, and she considered for a moment whether to. Then she said, "My mother died when I was 12. Fever. My father was a good man when he was well, but he had a grief that he couldn't put down, and he put it into whiskey instead, which is the kind of trade that only goes one way. He died 4 years ago. I went to stay with Edna, my cousin, in Fort Worth. She was kind enough to take me in, but she had her own problems, and I was one more." She kept her voice even. "I arranged a practical marriage to a man named Franklin Doyle who was supposed to settle my father's debts and give me a household to manage. He died of a fever before I arrived. I came on anyway because there was nothing behind me to go back to." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of loss," he said. "It's not more than most people carry," she said. "It's just mine." He turned his head and looked at her, and she felt the weight of that look, careful and complete, like a man taking stock of something he is considering seriously. "What was the debt?" he asked. "Your father's," she told him. It was not a large sum by the measure of a man who ran 60,000 acres, but it had been large enough to shape the last 4 years of her life into a series of practical decisions stripped of everything that was not survival. She spoke without bitterness because she had worked at releasing the bitterness a long time ago, and she thought she had mostly managed it. When she finished, Jeremiah was looking at the sky again. "I was engaged once," he said, in the tone of a man who has decided to return one confidence for another. "Girl named Alina from San Antonio. Her family had money and I had prospects, and it seemed to both families like a sensible arrangement." "What happened?" Cora asked. "She was a kind woman. She is a kind woman, I should say. She's married now to someone else and doing well from what I hear." He paused. "But she came to visit the ranch once before I bought the Crossbar, when I was still foreman on the Ridley spread to the north, and she looked at the land and the work and the life that went with it, and she said, very honestly and without cruelty, that it was not the life she had imagined." He looked at his hands. "I respected her for saying it plainly. A lot of women would have said yes and then found ways to be unhappy about it." "And you chose the land," Cora said. "The land was always going to be the choice," he said quietly. "I just hadn't understood that until then." She thought about what he was telling her and about what it cost him to tell it. "Plenty of everything," she said softly, almost to herself. He looked at her sharply. "What?" "You had the engagement and the prospect of money and the kind of arrangement that looks good from the outside," she said. "And none of it was the thing you actually needed." He looked at her for a long time. The stars had multiplied while they were sitting there, and the night sounds of the ranch had settled into their familiar rhythms. Horses shifting in the barn, something small moving in the brush beyond the fence, the faint sound of Maria's baby through the adobe wall. "I've had plenty of everything," he said slowly, as though he was hearing the words for the first time. "And none of it helped. Until something real came along," Cora said, meaning the land, meaning the Crossbar and Hector and the work that suited him, and not meaning herself at all, or at least that was what she told herself while she said it. He was quiet for so long that she thought he was not going to respond. Then he said, "You came here with nothing, you said." $4.62, she said. "And in 6 weeks you have kept my books, stopped a land dispute in its tracks, and delivered Hector's son." His voice was quiet but warm in a way she was learning to recognize. "I'd argue that whatever you came with, it was enough." She felt something move in her chest that she had been carefully keeping still, and she said very quietly, "That's a generous reading of the situation." "No," he said. "It's an honest one." He stood up then and offered her his hand to help her up, and she took it, and when she was on her feet he did not immediately release it. He stood there in the dark with her hand in his, and looked at her with those dark eyes and the stars coming up behind him. And she felt the universe arrange itself around that moment, with the precision of something that had always been going to happen. Then Billy appeared around the side of the house to say that supper was ready, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary evening, and they walked back to the main house separately, and Cora sat at the cookhouse table and ate her supper, and felt like a woman standing at the edge of something vast. November came in hard. The temperature dropped and the range turned brown, and the work of the ranch shifted into the particular heavy labor of winter preparation, mending fences and moving cattle to lower pastures, and ensuring the hay stores were sufficient. Cora found herself more useful than she had expected, not just in the office but in the practical running of things, keeping the supply records, managing the correspondence with the cattle buyers in Abilene and Fort Worth, drafting letters that Jeremiah dictated to her in the evenings while he sat across the desk and put his thoughts into careful, minimal words, and she turned them into something that would be received well on the other end. They developed, in those long November evenings, a way of talking that was different from the way either of them talked to anyone else. It was direct in a way that frontier practicality had taught them both to value, but it had underneath it a kind of attention, a quality of actually listening that went beyond the exchange of information. He asked her opinions and did not just tolerate them but genuinely considered them. She asked about cattle and range and weather and the politics of the land, and he answered as though it was natural to be asked. She was aware of what was happening. She was not naive, and she was not a romantic in the reckless sense. But she was also increasingly aware that her careful practical categorization of Jeremiah Walden as her employer was becoming, in the way of things that grow in the dark without permission, something substantially more complicated than that. On a Thursday evening in mid-November, they were working late in the office over a difficult piece of correspondence to a buyer who had disputed the weight count on the last cattle shipment. It was a matter of money and professional reputation both, and the letter needed to be precise without being aggressive, and they had been working on it for over an hour. The fire in the small iron stove in the corner had burned down to coals, and the room had gotten cold, and Cora had put her shawl over her shoulders without breaking the rhythm of the work. At some point she became aware that Jeremiah had stopped talking. She looked up from the paper where she had been writing and found him looking at her, not at the letter, not at the desk, just at her, with an expression that had entirely given up on being neutral. "What?" she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to be plain about it because I think you deserve plainness." Her heart made a movement that was not entirely dignified. She kept her voice steady. "All right." He was silent for a moment, gathering himself the way she had seen him gather himself before a difficult conversation, that deliberate settling of the whole frame of him. "I am not good at this," he said. "I want to say that first. I am better at cattle and land and work than I am at saying what I mean when what I mean is about a person. You seem to be managing so far," she said, because she could feel that he needed something to hold on to. He looked at the desk for a moment, then back at her. "You came here with nothing, you said. That's the word you used, nothing to offer. And I've been thinking about that word for weeks because it's the wrongest word I've ever heard applied to a person." Cora was very still. "I have run this ranch for 4 years," he said. "I have had money enough and land enough in hands who are loyal and cattle that are sound in every practical thing that a man in my position is supposed to have." He paused. "And I have been for most of that time fairly alone in the way that matters, not lonesome, alone. There is a difference." "Yes," she said softly. "There is. You came in on that stage with your broken bag and $4, and you walked into my barn and told me my foreman was stealing from me, and held a deed up at Douglas Hale's face and delivered Hector's boy, and sat on that step and talked to me like I was a person worth talking to." And he stopped. He looked at her very directly. "I am trying to say that I think you are the most genuinely good person I have ever met, and that everything I have had before you came here is considerably less than I had after, and I would like, very much, if you were willing, to know you better than I do." Cora looked at him in the firelight, this man who ran 60,000 acres and could not say what he meant without working hard at it, this man who had chosen land over a comfortable arrangement and had been alone in the way that mattered ever since, this man who laughed like something that didn't get enough use and looked at her across muddy yards in the yellow light before a rain. "I am already not sure you could pay me enough to go anywhere else," she said quietly. He looked at her for a moment. Then that laugh came again, the genuine rough one that changed his face. He reached across the desk and took her hand, not gently in the way of men who are unsure, but firmly, like a man who has made a decision and is committing to it. They sat like that for a while, with the coals glowing in the stove and the night outside pressing against the windows, and did not finish the letter to the cattle buyer until considerably later. The letter, when it was finished, was very good. The cattle buyer replied within a week, acknowledging the error in the weight records and paying the difference. Jeremiah put the letter on Cora's desk without comment, and she found it when she came in the next morning and understood that he was telling her something about partnership. December moved through the ranch with the cold clarity of West Texas winter. Cora and Jeremiah were careful with one another in the way that careful people are when something genuinely important is at stake. They did not rush. He came to supper at the cookhouse and sat beside her. He brought her coffee in the mornings when he came in from the early work, setting it on the corner of the desk without ceremony. She walked the fence line with him one Saturday because she wanted to see the eastern section where the water rights ran, and he showed her the creek that ran along that border, thin and cold and clear, and explained why it mattered, not just for the ranch but for the cattle in the dry summer months. And she listened and asked questions and felt the land beginning to mean something to her the way it meant something to him. He told her about his family. He had grown up in Central Texas, the son of a man who had worked on other people's land all his life and never owned an acre of his own. His father had died believing that the gap between a working man and a man of property was unbridgeable, and Jeremiah had spent the years since proving that it was not, and had arrived at 31 with 60,000 acres and a hole somewhere in him that he had not known how to name until recently. She told him things she had not told anyone in Harlan Creek. About her mother, who had been a practical and loving woman who sang while she worked and had taught Cora that being capable was its own kind of grace. About her father, for whom she had the complicated love of someone who has watched a good person fail themselves and failed to save them. About the years in Fort Worth with Edna, which had been not unkind but thin, like living on bread and nothing else. "You've been taking care of people your whole life," he said one evening when she had been talking for a while. "Has anyone taken care of you?" She thought about it honestly. "My mother did," she said, "for 12 years. He nodded. "That's not enough years," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't." They held that between them for a moment, and then he said, in the straightforward way that was so particularly his, "I intend to see what I can do about that if you'll let me." She let him. Christmas at the Crossbar was a gathering. Hector and Maria brought their children and the new baby, who had been named Thomas and who was already demonstrating a healthy set of lungs that had nothing whatsoever in common with the quiet dignity his parents maintained. Ruth Bancroft came out from town and brought a pie. Pete Calloway sent a box of provisions with Billy, who had gone to town for supplies, and came back with it strapped to the back of his horse with the proud efficiency of a young man given a useful errand. The cook, an older man named Garza who had worked for Jeremiah from the beginning, and who took his work seriously and silently, produced a meal of extraordinary accomplishment given the available materials. Jeremiah stood at the head of the table in the main house where they had all gathered and looked down its length at the people assembled there, and Cora, sitting at his right hand because that was where he had placed her chair, watched him look at them, and saw in his face something she recognized. That look of a man taking stock of the good things in his life and finding them, for possibly the first time, genuinely adequate. He looked at her. She looked at him. He reached under the table and took her hand briefly and let it go. Ruth Bancroft, sitting across from her, caught her eye and said nothing at all with a great deal of satisfaction. January was cold and hard-working. The cattle buyers came in February, and the negotiations were long and involved, and Cora sat in on them at Jeremiah's insistence, taking notes and catching 2 arithmetic errors in the buyer's favor that she corrected without apology, which made the lead buyer look at her with a complicated expression and Jeremiah with a less complicated one. The final price was 7% above what the buyers had opened with. Afterward, when the buyers had gone and the hands had gone to celebrate with considerably more discretion than the cattle buyers had shown, Jeremiah found her in the office calculating the final numbers, and he stood in the doorway and said, 7%. The weight and condition of the herd justified it, she said. The weight and condition of the herd's bookkeeper didn't hurt, he said. She looked up and found him smiling at her, a full and uncomplicated smile that she had discovered was rare enough to be worth something significant every time it appeared. Jeremiah, she said, because she had been thinking about something and she had decided to say it. Cora, he said, in the tone of a man who has learned to listen when she begins a sentence that way. I would like to stay here, she said. Not as the bookkeeper, not only as the bookkeeper. She held his gaze steadily because she had decided to be plain and she was going to see it through. I came here with nothing to offer and you gave me work and a room and something I haven't had in a long time, which is a place where I belong. And I want you to know that I am not telling you this because of the room or the work. I am telling you this because you are the kind of man I did not know existed and I do not want to be anywhere else. He was very still. I also want to be plain about the fact that I have no money, no family connections that are useful, no land of my own, and no particular social advantage, she continued. I came here with nothing, as I said, and that has not changed. If you are looking for a practical arrangement, I am not it. Jeremiah crossed the room in 3 strides and took her face in both his rough hands and kissed her, which was a considerably more direct response than she had anticipated and significantly more satisfying. When he pulled back, he looked at her with those dark eyes and said, I told you, I've had plenty of everything. The money, the arrangement that made practical sense, the prospect of the kind of life that looks correct from the outside. He shook his head. None of it helped. None of it was this. None of it was you. Cora felt something in her chest that she recognized after a moment as happiness. Uncomplicated, genuine, arrived at happiness, the kind that does not come easily to people who have spent a long time doing without it. All right then, she said. He proposed formally on a Sunday in early March, on the steps of the church after the service, which meant that every person in Harlan Creek witnessed it and Pete Calloway actually applauded, which was the kind of response that small towns produce when something genuinely good happens to people they have decided to care about. Cora said yes with a clarity that made Ruth Bancroft cry, which Ruth immediately denied and which everyone present saw. They were married in April, when the range was showing the first green of spring and the weather was soft. The ceremony was in the church, conducted by the pastor, who was a weathered man named Ames who had been marrying and burying the people of Harlan Creek for 15 years, and who recognized, in Cora and Jeremiah's faces, the quality of genuine and considered love that was different from the serviceable affection he had blessed in other ceremonies. Cora wore a dress that Maria had helped her make from fabric ordered from the general store, a simple pale blue that made her gray eyes look like the sky before a rain. She did not have a veil. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Billy had appeared with that morning, slightly wilted from being carried 4 miles into town, which she thought was one of the most touching things she had ever been given. Hector Rodriguez stood as Jeremiah's witness. Ruth Bancroft stood as Cora's. Baby Thomas, who was now 5 months old and opinionated about noise, contributed his own commentary to the ceremony from Maria's arms, and nobody minded. When Jeremiah took her hand at the altar and looked at her, he looked like a man who had traveled a long way through difficult country to arrive somewhere good, and she looked back at him with the same recognition. I do, she said, when the pastor asked her, and she meant it in all the ways a person can mean 2 words. The reception was at the Crossbar in the yard in front of the main house. Garza cooked. Pete Calloway brought goods from the store. Several ranchers from neighboring properties came, including one older couple from 10 miles north who had known Jeremiah since before he bought the Crossbar, who shook his hand and told him he had made a sound choice, which they said while looking at Cora with the approving nods of people who take the measure of a person quickly and accurately. Douglas Hale did not come, which was fine. He had quietly dropped his claim to the water rights after his inquiry at the land office in Harlan Creek, had produced the same information Cora had given him in the yard that October afternoon. The county clerk in Abilene had confirmed the Crossbar's rights were unassailable. Douglas Hale had gone back to managing what remained of his father's property and had not bothered them since, which was the best possible outcome of that particular situation. That evening, after the guests had gone and the ranch had quieted, and the night had come down soft and star-heavy over the range, Cora stood on the porch of the main house and looked out at the 60,000 acres that were now hers by marriage and by the slower and more genuine process of having come to love them, and felt the vastness of the place not as emptiness, but as room. Room to be the person she was without apology or reduction. Jeremiah came to stand beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood there in the April night and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "Are you sorry?" he asked. She turned her head and looked up at him. "For which part?" "Any of it," he said. "All of it. The stage from Fort Worth. The $4.62. She thought about the broken carpetbag. She thought about Edna's crowded house and the solicitor's letter and the long stage ride west through flat brown country into a place that had not been anything to her yet. She thought about the barn doorway and the man with the ledger book and the irritation on his face, and the moment on the step outside Hector's house when everything had started to become visible. "Not for a moment," she said. He pulled her a little closer and she could feel him smile against her hair. The summer was full. The ranch was busy in the productive and satisfying way of a well-run operation at its best season, cattle fat on good grass, hands in good spirits, the books clean and accurate, and reflecting the work of people who did their jobs with care. Cora found to her surprise that she was not merely the bookkeeper anymore, or not only that. She was a person whom the ranch hands brought their questions to, not just financial ones but practical ones. How to word a letter home, how to manage a disagreement between two men about bunk arrangements, how to ask Jeremiah for something without it coming out wrong. She became, without having planned it, a kind of center of gravity for the daily human workings of the place. Jeremiah noticed and did not remark on it directly, but one evening he said to her, in the middle of a completely different conversation, "This ranch is better than it was before you came," and she understood that he was not only talking about the accounts. She also, in the summer, began to know the land. She had understood it at first as a map, acreage and sections and water rights and fence lines. But she began to know it in the other way, the sensory way, the way of someone who gets up before light and walks out to see the sun come up over flat country that goes all the way to the edge of the world, or who stands in a windstorm and watches the grass turn silver-gray as the wind moves through it, or who learns which water hole the cattle favor in the heat of the afternoon and which draw catches the most shade. She went riding with Jeremiah on Sunday mornings when the work allowed it, out across the range, and he told her about the land the way he told her everything, in the minimal precise language of a man who does not use words wastefully. He showed her the springs that fed the creek in the eastern section, the ones that Douglas Hale had wanted and that were worth wanting, cold and clear in the summer heat. He showed her the mesa to the north where you could see 40 miles in clear weather. He showed her the particular draw where the wild plum trees grew, small and stubborn and improbably beautiful, that his predecessor had planted decades ago and that had no practical purpose, and that he had never had the heart to remove. She loved him more for the wild plum trees. They had been married 4 months when Cora understood that she was pregnant. She was not surprised exactly, but she sat with the knowledge for a day before she told him, not from hesitation but from wanting to hold it quietly for a moment, this private certainty before it became shared. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper. They were sitting on the porch, a thing they did most evenings when the work was done, sitting in the two chairs they had moved out there because they liked the evening air and the stars. She said it plainly, as she said most things, and he went very still in the way he went still when something hit him square. Then he reached over and took her hand with both of his and held it and did not say anything for a moment, and the silence was not empty but was full of something that words would have been smaller than. "Good," he said finally. She laughed. "That's all you have to say." "What else is there?" he said, and his voice was rough at the edges with something that was not quite manageable. "Good. Everything good." He sent Billy to town the next morning to let Pete Calloway know, because apparently that was the correct way to communicate major news in Harlan Creek, and by Sunday the entire congregation knew, and Ruth Bancroft, who had been sitting behind her, reached forward and squeezed her shoulder with both hands. The pregnancy was uncomplicated. Cora continued to work, because she was healthy and practical, and because sitting still made her restless, and because the quarterly cattle report would not write itself. She was 7 months along when she trained a young man named Sam, recently hired and sharp-minded, in the basics of the bookkeeping, not because she intended to stop, but because she was sensible about having a backup. Jeremiah hovered with the specific anxiety of a man who does not know what to be afraid of but is afraid anyway. He was not overbearing. He was simply, quietly, vigilant in a way that made her feel looked after without feeling managed, which was a balance she had not known could exist until him. The baby came in late February of 1880, a Sunday morning, as though the child had scheduling preferences. The weather was calm and the light was good, and Maria, who had become the closest thing to family that Cora had in the territory, was there by mid-morning, along with the doctor from Abilene whom Jeremiah had arranged to have on standby in Harlan Creek for 2 weeks prior, which was the kind of preparation that told you everything about the man. It was a boy. He was large and healthy and had Jeremiah's dark eyes and Cora's square, serious chin, and when they handed him to Jeremiah, standing by the bed in the mid-morning light, the expression on Jeremiah's face was something that Cora stored carefully in the part of herself where she kept the things she did not want to forget. They named him Daniel, after her father and the better version of him that she chose to remember. Harlan Creek received the news with the warmth that small western communities extend to births, because children meant continuation, meant permanence, meant that the people who had come to this hard and beautiful country intended to stay and make something of it. Pete Calloway put a small sign in the store window. Ruth Bancroft brought a quilt she had made, which was blue and warm and would last decades. Hector shook Jeremiah's hand with both of his and said, simply, "Good," and then looked away because he was a man who wore his feelings on the inside. Daniel Walden grew through his first year with the healthy stubbornness of a child who has decided to be alive and takes the project seriously. He was loud and curious and reached for everything within arm's length, and he had the extraordinary capacity of infants to reorganize an entire household around their requirements without appearing to put any effort into it. Cora found motherhood to be a thing she had not adequately anticipated. Not the difficulty of it, which she had expected, but the quality of it, the way it expanded the territory of things you would do for something, the way it made the world both more frightening and more vivid. Jeremiah was a good father in the way he was a good man, without ceremony and with complete commitment. He held Daniel in the evenings when Cora needed her hands free. He talked to him, not in the simplified speech some parents used, but in his regular voice, telling the child about the ranch and the cattle and what needed doing, as though the boy was a small colleague being briefed on the operation, which made Cora laugh every time. By the time Daniel was walking, Cora had taken the ranch's bookkeeping to a level of organization that would have impressed a bank. She had created a system of records that tracked everything from the cattle count to the hay stores to the maintenance costs of the equipment, and she had taught Sam enough that the two of them operated the financial side of the Crossbar with an efficiency that made the quarterly buyers' meetings run considerably faster than they used to the buyers' unconcealed relief. The ranch grew. In the fall of 1881, Jeremiah had the opportunity to acquire an adjoining section to the northwest, 2,000 acres that a neighboring rancher was selling due to age and the desire to move closer to his children in San Antonio. The price was fair and the land was good, and the water access was solid. Cora worked the numbers for 3 days and presented him with an analysis that was thorough and clear-eyed. "It's a good investment if the cattle market holds," she said. "If it doesn't hold for 2 years, we'd be stretched. Not broken, but stretched." "What do you think the market will do?" he asked. "Hold for at least 3, she said. "The railroad expansion into West Texas is bringing more buyers, not fewer. The Fort Worth stockyards are growing. The demand is there." He looked at her analysis for a long moment. "Buy it," he said. They bought it. The cattle market held, as she had predicted, and the new section proved itself in the first summer with water access that took pressure off the eastern springs in the dry months. Douglas Hale, whose property sat between the old Crossbar boundary and the new section, was observed by Billy to look extremely irritated about the whole thing, which no one at the Crossbar spent any time worrying about. In the spring of 1882, Ruth Bancroft, who had been quietly and steadfastly single since her husband's death 4 years prior, announced her intention to marry a man named George Altman, a carpenter who had moved to Harlan Creek from Kansas the previous year, and who was quiet and kind and built things with his hands with the same precision and care that Ruth applied to everything she did. Cora was her witness at the ceremony, standing where Ruth had stood for her 3 years earlier, and she felt the rightness of it, the way that good things come around to people who deserve them if they are patient and honest and do not collapse in the meantime. She told Ruth afterward, over coffee at the Callaway store because Pete had set out chairs and insisted on the occasion, that she was happier than she could say. Ruth looked at her with the clear-eyed affection of a genuine friend and said, "You know, when you walked into this town with that broken bag, and that look on your face like someone who was not going to ask for help even if they needed it, I thought, there is a woman who is going to be fine or die trying." "I was fine," Cora said. "You were more than fine," Ruth said. "You were exactly what was needed." Cora thought about that. She thought about the stage from Fort Worth and the $4.62, and the letter from the solicitor and the barn doorway and the ledger book, and the man who had looked up from it with irritation in his face and weariness in his eyes. She thought about everything she had not been in the beginning. Not wealthy, not well-connected, not beautiful in the way that smoothed a path, not arriving with any gift except the capacity for honest work and the willingness to pay attention. She had been the bride who came with nothing to offer. That was how it had felt. That was the accounting she had done of herself, standing on that sidewalk with the broken carpetbag and the sparse coins and the dissolved arrangement. And she had been wrong, not about the carpetbag or the coins, which were accurate facts, but about what constituted an offering. The autumn of 1882 brought a second pregnancy, which Cora discovered with a feeling of uncomplicated joy that surprised her with its completeness. Daniel was 2.5 by then, a solid, serious child who followed his father around the yard with an expression of deep concentration, and his mother around the office with a look of patient expectation, for whenever the book of figures she was working on might become interesting enough to include him. She told Jeremiah on the porch again in the evening, and again he held her hand and was quiet for a moment before he said anything. "Good," he said, with the same rough warmth as before. "You really only have the one word for this," she said. "I have more," he said, and then leaned over and kissed her temple and said against her hair, "Perfect. Right, exactly right. Enough." "Enough," she said. This child came in late spring of 1883, a girl, healthy and pink and immediately vocal about her opinions in a way that made the doctor from Abilene laugh and say she had excellent lung development. They named her Clara after no one in particular, because the name suited her and they both felt it when they said it. Daniel regarded his sister with the grave seriousness of a 3-year-old encountering something he had not been fully briefed on, and then, within 2 days, appointed himself her guardian with a dedication that charmed every adult in the vicinity and occasionally complicated the management of the nursery. The summer of 1883 was busy and warm and full of the particular texture that a life builds when it is working correctly. The ranch operated with the steady, productive rhythm of something well-maintained. The books were clean. The cattle were good. Hector's son Thomas, who was now 5 years old, and Daniel Walden, who was 3, had formed the kind of alliance between young boys that is primarily physical and largely incomprehensible to adults. Baby Clara was passed between Maria and Cora and Ruth Altman, with the communal ease of women who have decided that the village is the right model for child-rearing. On a Sunday afternoon in August, when the heat was at its most pressing, and the whole ranch had found its various places to be still in it, Cora sat on the porch with Clara asleep in the cradle beside her and watched Jeremiah come across the yard from the barn. He had been checking on a horse that had been favoring one leg, and he moved with the easy, unhurried stride of a man at home in his body and in his place, wiping his hands on a rag as he came. He came up the porch steps and looked at Clara and then at Cora, and his face in the afternoon light was the face she knew best in the world, every line of it familiar and particular and dear. "How's the leg?" she asked. "Better," he said. Poultice did it. He sat down in his chair and they were quiet together in the way they had perfected over 5 years of marriage, the particular comfortable quiet of two people who have stopped needing to fill space. After a while he said, "Do you remember what you said to me the first week you were here, when Hale came?" "I said a great deal of things," she said. "I had a deed in my hand." "Before that," he said, "in the barn, you said, I've had glamour before and it didn't particularly help me." She looked at him. "I remember. I've been thinking about that for 5 years," he said, "because I said something like it too, eventually, that night outside Hector's house. I said I'd had plenty of everything and none of it helped." "You did say that," she said, "and I meant it differently then than I mean it now," he said. He looked at the range, gold and brown in the August light running out to the horizon in every direction. "Then I meant it as a description of lack, all the things that hadn't been right. Eleanor, the arrangement, the way the ranch was prosperous but hollow." He paused. "Now I mean it as an explanation of necessity. Of why it mattered so much when something real came along." Cora looked at him. "Are you making a speech?" "I'm trying to," he said with a rough smile. "I'm not very good at them." "You're getting better," she said. He reached over and took her hand, as he had taken it so many times on that porch in all the seasons. "What I'm trying to say," he said, "is that you came here with nothing to offer by your accounting, and you were wrong by mine. And I have been grateful every day since October of 1878 that a stage stopped in Harlan Creek and let you off it." She felt the warmth of it spread through her. This man and this porch and this ranch and this life. This child sleeping in the cradle and the other one somewhere in the yard with his small friend. The books clean in the office, and the cattle good on the range, and the water in the eastern section running clear and cold and uncontested. "I was wrong about what I had to offer," she said. "I was right that I didn't have money or connections, but those weren't the right currency." "No," he said, "they weren't." Clara made a small sound in the cradle, the pre-waking signal that meant 10 minutes before full volume, and Cora stood to pick her up, and Jeremiah stood too, and for a moment they both stood on the porch of the house that was theirs, with the child between them and the land running out in all directions and the August sky above it enormous and blue. "I love you," she said, which was a thing she said without ceremony, frequently, because she had learned that it was the kind of thing that deserved to be said out loud. "I love you," he said back, in the same register, the one that was neither grand nor small but simply true. Clara opened her eyes and looked at them both with the expression of someone who has important matters to attend to and has decided to get started. The years built on one another with the solid, accumulating weight of a life genuinely lived. By 1885, the Crossbar had grown to nearly 75,000 acres. The third cattle shipment under the expanded operation had come in above projection, and Sam had been promoted to full ranch manager for the financial operations, a title Cora had proposed, and Jeremiah had confirmed without hesitation. Daniel started school in Ruth Altman's classroom in September of that year, walking into it with his father's directness and his mother's capacity for application. And Ruth wrote Cora a short note after the first week saying that her son was going to be either a lawyer or a tyrant, and that she was placing her bet on lawyer with fond optimism. Clara, at 2 years old, had the personality of someone who has already made up her mind about most things and is politely waiting for the world to catch up. She had Cora's gray eyes and Jeremiah's stubbornness, and a laugh that came from somewhere deeper than should have been possible for someone her size. In the spring of 1886, Cora discovered she was pregnant for the third time, which she received with the equanimity of a woman for whom this territory was now known, and Jeremiah received with the equanimity of a man who had learned that his response of one word was going to be permanent, and had made his peace with it. The third child, a boy they named William, arrived in October of 1886, healthy and untroubled, and the ranch absorbed him into its life with the ease of a place that had enough room and enough warmth for whatever came. By the time William was taking his first steps in the summer of 1887, Harlan Creek had changed somewhat in the way that West Texas towns changed as the territory settled. The railroad had extended a spur closer to the county, which meant the cattle drives to Abilene were shorter, and the communication with the outside world was faster. New families had come in. The school had expanded to 2 rooms, and Ruth Altman had taken on an assistant teacher. Pete Calloway had expanded the general store and taken on a partner. A proper doctor had established a practice in town, which was a development that Cora considered one of the most materially significant improvements to life in Harlan Creek in her time there. Douglas Hale had sold his property in 1885 and moved away, and the new owners were decent people with no interest in disputing water rights, which closed the last active source of friction on the Crossbar's borders. The ranch was at peace, internally and externally, in the way that things are at peace when they have been built on honest work and genuine relationships. Hector and Maria's Thomas was 9 years old and Daniel Walden's closest friend, and the two of them were a recurring element of the landscape of the ranch, appearing at meals, disappearing into the range for hours, returning with dirt and stories and the private satisfaction of children who have been genuinely free for an afternoon. On a Saturday in September of 1887, Cora sat at the desk in the office that she had made entirely her own over 9 years. The walls hung with survey maps and the quarterly records in their neat rows, baby William in a cradle nearby because she preferred his company, and added up the annual account. She was not simply reconciling numbers. She was reading the story that numbers tell when they are arranged by someone who understands both mathematics and meaning. The ranch was sound, more than sound. It was good. She wrote the final figure at the bottom of the column and set down her pen and looked at it for a moment, and felt the particular satisfaction of work that means something, that contributes to something real. Jeremiah appeared in the doorway, as he had appeared in doorways of this office for 9 years, and leaned against the frame and looked at her with the expression that had started somewhere between wary and calculating, and had traveled over time to something warm and permanent. "How does it look?" he asked. "Good," she said. He smiled. "That's usually my word." "I've been here long enough to adopt it," she said. He came into the office and bent down and looked at William, who was awake and considering the ceiling with the systematic attention of a very young person cataloging a new world. Then he straightened and looked at Cora, and the look had in it everything that 9 years of shared life accumulates. The mornings and the difficult conversations and the births and the seasons and the decisions made together across this desk, the cattle buyers and the land disputes, and the Sunday mornings on the range with the grass going silver in the wind. "I want to show you something," he said. She left William with Maria, who was in the kitchen, and followed Jeremiah outside to where 2 horses were saddled, and they rode north together on the road that went up past the new section toward the mesa he had shown her once in her first year on the ranch. The September afternoon was extraordinary, the sky the deep blue of late summer, the air beginning to carry the first cool suggestion of autumn. The range stretched out in every direction in the particular gold and brown and green of that season. They rode for 30 minutes in comfortable silence, the horses moving well, the ranch spread out below them as they climbed. At the top of the mesa he stopped and they both looked out, and she could see 40 miles in every direction, the way he had told her you could see on a clear day, the town of Harlan Creek in the south, the gleam of the creek in the east, the new section to the northwest with its grass already browning for the season. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" he asked. "You told me I could see 40 miles, she said. "Can you?" She looked. "At least," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The horses stood easy. Below them the crossbar stretched in every direction, everything that they had built and managed and grown together. "I want to build on the east side of the main house," he said. "A proper library. You've got books stacked in every room and no place for them." She looked at him. "A library. You've been asking about it for 3 years in small ways," he said, mentioning, never directly asking. "I want you to stop not quite asking and just have it." She looked at him in the September light and felt the love she had for him, which was not the startled early kind that she had worked so hard to be sensible about, but the deep and settled kind that comes from knowing a person truly over time, their strengths and their limitations and their particular way of being in the world. "All right," she said. "All right. Build me the library," she said. He reached over from his horse and took her hand, as he had taken it so many times, and held it for a moment in the afternoon light with the 40-mile view spread out around them and the sky enormous above them. "Cora Doyle," he said, which was what he called her sometimes, using the name she had come with, the name she had arrived with in the broken carpetbag, and the $4.62, not the name she had built here but the one she had started from. "Jeremiah Walden," she said back in the same register. He looked at her for a long moment with everything he had ever felt for her visible in his face, which was the kind of face that had learned over 9 years to let things be seen by the one person it trusted entirely. "I have had plenty of everything," he said quietly, "and none of it helped. And then you came off a stage with a broken bag and told me I was being robbed." She laughed, and it carried out over the range in the afternoon air. "The best day's work I ever did," she said. "The best day of my life," he said, simple and direct and entirely true. They sat on the mesa in the September light for a while longer, the 2 horses standing patient and easy. The ranch spread below them in all directions, 9 years of honest work and genuine love, laid out across 60,000 acres of West Texas under a sky that went on forever. Then they rode back down together, side by side, through the gold and brown of the afternoon, back to the ranch house where their children were, back to the life they had built out of nothing and everything, back to the only place either of them had ever stood and felt entirely, completely, irreversibly at home. The library was finished by the following spring, 12 feet by 15. With shelves on 3 walls and a window seat facing east where the morning light came in first. And Cora filled it with every book she had collected, and several new ones ordered from a bookseller in Fort Worth. And she sat in that window seat on a March morning in 1888 with William on her lap and Daniel and Clara arguing amicably at the kitchen table over something she could not quite hear. And Jeremiah coming in from the early work with 2 cups of coffee, setting hers on the window seat beside her as he had set it on the desk corner for nearly a decade, and felt the completeness of it, the full, closed, unambiguous. completeness of a life that had arrived somewhere genuinely good, not because she had come with money or connections or the right kind of arrangement, not because some practical calculation had worked out in her favor, but because she had come anyway with what she had, which turned out to be the right thing after all, and a man had looked up from a ledger book in a barn and seen her, and she had looked back, and neither of them had ever looked away. She picked up her coffee and held it in both hands and looked out the east window at the morning coming up over the range, and was happy, in the full and uncomplicated and deeply earned way that she had not known was possible until it was simply, undeniably, finally here.